Check.
Hi. I'm good. Oh, thank you.
I'm Julia. I help Sean. Did he tell you about this book?
No, he didn't.
If we have all our presenters sign it, if you wouldn't mind, I can bring it up here for
Oh,
you.
no.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. A couple of announcements. And if, as you know, if you have a cell phone, please silence it now if you would. Next Tuesday, we were to have John Grinspan here. His book is called Wide Awake. He is not able to make it, so I have booked Earl Nicodemus, who's a local professor, and his program will be the Curtis family of West Liberty and the 12th West Virginia Regiment. And so that will be December 3rd at noon, and then on the 10th, we're dedicating this auditorium to the memory of our friend Harold Vitale. And so we'll have some food and we'll celebrate Harold's life and rename the auditorium. Very exciting. Today we have Alaina Roberts. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh and the multi-award-winning author of I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, which uses archival research and family history to upend the traditional story of Reconstruction. She's written for Time Magazine, High Country News, and the Washington Post, and her research has been featured in CNN, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the New Yorker, and the Atlantic. Please welcome Dr. Alaina Roberts.
Hey. Good afternoon. Is this good? Can you hear me? Okay. Sean's a little bit taller than me, so got to make a little adjustment. Thank you so much for having me here today. I think this is the first time I've maybe eaten right before a talk just to make sure I didn't see any food that made me really hungry. So I am here to tell you a little bit about my work. I'm kind of going to summarize my book, but bring in the family history that is woven throughout it to kind of tell you why this is important to me as a subject, but also why I think it should be interesting to you. So like most people who identify as African Americans, I knew that I came from people who were enslaved for generations. This is kind of the traditional story of African Americans, of course. But it was only in college that I learned that on my father's side, the people who enslaved my ancestors were not white. They were Native Americans. In the 1830s, they, along with their Chickasaw and Choctaw slave owners, embarked on a journey that we know today as the Trail of Tears. They made their way to Oklahoma, which was then known as Indian Territory. During the Civil War, their owners fought for the Confederacy, and they tried to maintain slavery. But then when the Confederacy lost, the United States forced my family's owners, along with every other slaveholder, to free their slaves and give them land. So that is a quick summary, and within that summary is kind of the parallel that runs throughout my family's history, so very similar to, but different from, African American history. But then also really, kind of a rewriting of the way we think of the Civil War and the 19th century as a whole. And so that's kind of the core of my book. And I want to begin by introducing you to some of the people that you see on the cover of my book and people who are my own family members. So the woman in the black, her name is Lydia. And the woman in the white is her daughter. Her name is Josie. And so both of these women were on the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. And their slave owners were a Chickasaw couple named the Grants. And so the Chickasaws were not the only Native people who owned slaves. There were 5 in total who owned slaves in the same model as white Americans in the South. So the Chickasaws, the Choctaws, who are related to my family, but then also the Cherokees, the Seminoles, and the Creeks. And of course, the Cherokees are probably one of the most well-known Native nations in the country, maybe even in the world. But this part of their history is not usually known. And so all of these Indian nations are also southeastern peoples. So Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, parts of North Carolina, these were the homelands of these people, kind of the original Southerners. And so all of these peoples, had their own lives for thousands of years in North America before Europeans ever stepped foot here. But then, as European nations and then Americans began to make inroads into this continent, they of course had to deal with Native peoples. And so they traded with them, they made treaties and alliances and arrangements with them, they fought with them. And when the United States became an entity that was gaining power, they began to talk to these peoples, and they said, we think that the best way for us to have a relationship is if you became more like us, basically. So it would be peaceful if you, learned English, if you sent your children to school so that they could learn things like, Greek history, religion. So conversion was an important part of becoming like Americans. Henry Knox, who was the Secretary of War under George Washington, called this the civilization policy. So making Native people like white Americans was civilizing them because they were looked at as people who had things wrong with them, but they could change. They could improve themselves, better themselves, and to white Americans' view, that would, improve things, that would make things better. And then they could live peacefully amongst one another. And so Native Americans in these tribes, some of them, were open to this. They had saw what happened in the Northeast. There were lots of wars in that period of time. You're probably aware that there was disease, lots of Native American people dying. And so they looked at, how can we kind of make a better life for ourselves and improve these relations with these newcomers who clearly aren't going to leave anytime soon. And so the things that I've mentioned, dress, religion, these are key to a society, but so too was slavery in the 1700s. Like the United States is looking at this as a system that's important to their founding, to their burgeoning economic system. And so as Native people are deciding what changes to make in order to make their lives better, slavery is something that makes sense. Like if this is what, the elite in these societies, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, these men are slaveholders, they're powerful, influential, and so Native people saying, I want to better myself as well, it makes sense that they would say slavery is clearly something that we also need to adopt. And so adopting slavery is adopting an economic system, but it's also a social system, of course. It's a way of arranging people. It's a way of determining how you're going to think of and treat people. And so when Native Americans first saw Europeans and Africans, they view them as equally different, equally foreign, weird, their skin color was different. But as things began to change, as they saw how everyone was treated, they saw that there were benefits to working with white people. Europeans and Americans, they had power, they could make decisions. Africans offered them nothing. Like if they took these people into their tribes on an equal basis, they would get in trouble by the colonial powers. Like South Carolina, there were always enslaved people running away from there, trying to get to Spanish Florida, trying to get to Native nations. And if they took those people in, that wasn't good for them. Whereas if they turned them in, if they became part of this slavery system, that benefited them. They can make money. They were looked at as good allies. And so I'm kind of trying to give you an idea of the mindset of Native people. Like this is a choice that they make to become slaveholders, but also it's a choice made within the context of all these other different things happening, all these other different options that they have available to them to kind of determine how they're going to be treated in this period of time. And so as they make this decision to own slaves, they create all of the same laws that the U.S. South has and a lot of the North. So things like that you may be familiar with, like the inability to teach slaves to read or write. That was outlawed in most of the South and some in the North. That was outlawed in all of these 5 tribes as well, because you didn't want people to be educated. You didn't want people to be able to spread ideas. There were laws against meeting together in large groups. So usually any more than 3 was a problem. because more than 3, that was a rebellion waiting to happen, was the fear. The laws on mobility, so you couldn't move freely if you didn't have a pass, because they wanted to know where you are, so they could control you, so they would know what you're doing, who you're talking to. And so when we think of what makes up a slave society, all of these are slave societies, because they're changing to fit the model that the United States is creating. And so we have these people living in the Southeast, creating these laws that echo the white Southerners around them. But in the 1820s and the 1830s, their lives change again. And so they have made these choices, I've told you, to make sure that they're treated a little better than other Native people, that they're not wiped out, that they're seen as people that Europeans and Americans can work with. But soon, in the 1820s and 1830s, when white American plantation owners want to expand, make more money, have larger plantations, they're looking at Mississippi and Georgia. There's also gold discovered in Georgia. And they're saying, why don't we have this land? Like, why are we allowing these Native Americans to keep this land? And so all of a sudden, the treaties that they made with Native people to respect their boundaries and respect their sovereignty as nations, all of a sudden those look kind of annoying, kind of inconvenient. And so eventually, with people like Andrew Jackson in the federal government, we have the Indian Removal Act, which says, okay, now we're going to treat with you, we're going to make an agreement with you to pay you for your land, literally pennies on the dollar, but pay you for your land and try to get you out, try to get you to the west of the Mississippi. And the justification for that is, white Southerners are going to do what they're going to do anyway. They're going to move onto your land, which they're already doing. They're going to squat on it. They're going to try to throw you off your houses, which they do. And so we might as well move you somewhere where you're going to be safe. And if you move to this place, we will never bother you again. We won't ever move there. And so the place they send them to is Indian Territory. And so Indian Territory literally is this name of this space, because the idea is that it's for Indians, it's for Native people, and white people are never going to go there. So this is Indian Territory, and as you can maybe see, it's Oklahoma without its tail. And so the fact that this is now the state of Oklahoma tells you that that promise is not kept. Of course, white Americans then later on decide they want this space too. But at this moment in time, in the 1820s and 30s, there is this idea that, we can both win. White people can have this land and these resources that we want, and also Native people can have other land if they move, and then they can be safe. And so Indian removal is often the only thing we might learn about Native American history in school. And so I learned that, thousands of people moved in those 5 tribes that I've shown you, but also, 20, 30 more. People die, people are sick. This is because whole tribes are moving, so the elderly, the young. So people, are moving on, sometimes walking, sometimes horses, sometimes steamboats if they have money. And every tribe has a different story. Every tribe has different circumstances as they move. But what I also write about in my book about Indian removal is that for these tribes who own slaves, it's a Native and Black experience, because enslaved people are walking or riding horses or going on steamboats, partly because some of these people already own enslaved Black people, but also this is really when Chickasaws and Choctaws began owning more and more enslaved people, because guess what? They're property that can move themselves. They can walk. And so you don't have to drag, your fancy furniture or other items that you have. You can sell all that stuff, and then you can buy enslaved people. They can walk alongside you, and then they can also help you rebuild once you get to your new home. And so when Native people arrive, I realized that what I never learned is that I thought of this place as empty. Like the 5 tribes and other people who are removed, they're being sent to this empty space, and that's going to be their new home. But that's actually not true. There are Native people across every space within North America, and this is the case for Indian Territory. There are already people there, like the Comanches, the Apaches, the Osage, the Choctaws, and when these 5 tribes arrive here, all of a sudden, there's a question, whose land is this really? Whose space am I on? Where am I gonna put my cows, my enslaved people, my house? And so they run into problems with the Native people already there. But because the 5 tribes are tribes who have made these changes to their societies, who think of themselves as differently, more like white Americans, they encounter these tribes in the West in a different way. And so one of their leaders, when he moves into Indian territory and he encounters these Western Native people, he says this. He says, "You never saw such a people in your life. Their manners and action are wild in the extreme. They are in a perfect state of nature and would be a curiosity to any civilized man." And so these kinds of words, this is what we expect from a white person talking about Native Americans in the 1700s or the 1800s. But this is probably not what we expect from another Native American. But, as I've kind of mentioned before, there are lots of different Native people. All of these Native nations have different experiences, and they also begin to think of themselves as very different. So the fact that I'm saying Native American right now is a term that didn't exist in this period of time. There was no kind of we are one race. It was we are still individual nations. And for this man, who is a Choctaw, and all of the tribes who own slaves, they are nations who think of themselves as better than other people, than other Native Americans who they see as wild, as uncivilized, because they haven't made these changes. They don't own slaves, they don't practice Christianity, they haven't been educated. And so this idea of race and slavery has kind of insidiously poisoned the way Native people consider themselves in their world and their societies. So they eventually kind of make peace with Western Native peoples. There's raiding going on, there's certainly killing, there's kidnapping, but eventually things kind of settle down. By the 1850s, these 5 slave-owning tribes have made Indian Territory their home. They built new houses, they built bigger plantations, they have kind of cotton trade going on with them in Arkansas and Texas. They built a school system. So the Chickasaws and Choctaws, the nations that my ancestors lived in, they have a better education system than the nearby southern states. And so a lot of people want to send their white children to go to school with Native people because they've built this up in such a way. But in the 1850s, of course, as you may also know, there are increasing discussions about slavery. Should slavery expand as we white Americans continue to expand into the West? What does it mean that Black Americans, want rights? Do they deserve these rights? Should they exercise the ability to do things like vote if there is emancipation? All these different ideas about this institution of labor. The same discussions are going on in slave-owning Indian nations because they have Black people in them. And so they're listening to what's going on in the United States, and they start worrying, what is that going to mean for us if they get rid of slavery? Are they going to pressure us to do the same? Are we going to be able to keep this labor system? And so when eventually they are approached by Confederates who have seceded, it looks like a pretty good deal for them. Because if they ally with them and the Confederacy wins, they get to keep slavery, and they get to really kind of have a relationship with people who share similar culture with them. Now, granted, these are states that have just pushed them out 30 years earlier, but they still, they have similar foodways. They have the idea that the federal government shouldn't interfere in local affairs. And so the Confederacy has a lot of similarities with Native American people. But there are divisions, just like there are in the United States. So not every Native person says, yes, the Confederacy makes sense for me. There are many Native people who want to fight for the United States. They own slaves. They want to keep this relationship that they have with the federal government. They say, at least we know this devil and what this devil usually does. We don't know the Confederacy. But the Confederacy also makes certain promises. Not only would they say, you can keep slavery, they also say, the United States doesn't respect you. They don't give you congressional representation, but we would in our Congress that we're creating. We would allow you to have a say in what's going on with our government. We would make sure that there are no white Confederates who move into your lands. And so there are kind of push and pull factors for the Confederacy and the Union, the United States. But if we also go back to this map, Indian Territory is right in the middle of an important kind of travel way for Confederate soldiers. And so this is a space where people are moving goods, soldiers themselves are moving, and so this is also a dangerous position to be in if you don't have a relationship with the Confederacy. The United States doesn't send them guns, it doesn't send them soldiers to help them defend themselves. And so, as I said, with slavery, I'm giving you the context so that we can see that these are options, that these are decisions made, not in a vacuum, but along with all these different things going on. And they decide to ally with the Confederacy and with the Union. So different people splitting, brother killing brother, just as in the United States often. And so there are about 14 battles fought in Indian Territory. So the Civil War is not just something fought in the Northeast or even Southeast. It's very much fought in different spaces of the war, even farther west than this. And Native people are fighting. So there are regiments made up of all Native men who fight for both the Union and the Confederacy. There are people who are Black and African descent in Indian Territory who run away to fight for the United States, just as what happens in the United States. And so all of the kind of parallel things that we know about in the Civil War are happening in this space as well. And so adding in Native American history gives us an understanding that people of all races and ethnicities are involved in these same conversations and in these same physical battles. So, of course, the Confederacy loses, as we know. And when this happens, the United States does not look at all these things that I've laid out for you and say, you know, gosh, like we put Indian Territory and these Native people in a very difficult situation. Like we didn't send them any help, and they were in a space where they had to make these sorts of agreements. Like, we should take that into account. No, they say, actually, what you did was wrong. You shouldn't have made any sort of agreement with the Confederacy. And to punish you, we're going to take almost 50% of this landmass. This land in Indian Territory that we said we would never move on to, it was yours forever, we're going to use this as basically an excuse to say we want more of this land for white settlement. And this is really kind of making progress with what had already been happening. So even during the war, in 1862, the United States had started surveying the land here, kind of seeing, you know, what resources do they have, where would we maybe want settlers to move. And so they're already planning to do this, but this gives them justification on their part. The ability to say, you know, you didn't stay loyal, and so we're going to take this from you. And this is far more of a punishment than white Confederates received. There are plenty of white Confederates who get to keep their horses. Only the kind of top leaders have to go to kind of Andrew Johnson and kiss the ring. Most Confederates, you know, go home, it's fine now. You're back in the United States. But that's not the case for Native people. And so one of the kind of key ways of punishing them is this land, and that land is taken within the bounds of a treaty, of course, because treaties are the ways that Native nations and the United States come to agreements. And so in this treaty, they say, okay, you're giving up this amount of land, so all those 5 tribes give up portions of their land. But for my part, for my ancestors' part, these Black people who are enslaved in these nations, they also say, okay, you now have to free your slaves. This is what was kind of expected from the 5 tribes, that if the United States got rid of slavery, they would also expect the 5 tribes to do so. But in addition to, you know, freeing these slaves, they also say you have to give them all rights. And so these treaties are happening in 1866. So in these treaties, all of those rights are essentially what happens in the 13th and 14th Amendment and 15th Amendment. So they have voting rights. They have the ability to be equal politically with Native people, Native citizens in these tribes. In the United States, that doesn't happen until the 1870s. And so this is an earlier Reconstruction project, essentially, one that goes actually further. And I say further because in addition to that freedom, in addition to those equal rights, you also have that land that I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. And so for my ancestors, they got exactly 40 acres of land. And so if you're familiar with, you know, Civil War history, African American history, then you know that 40 acres is kind of an important, relevant number because this is the idea that African Americans who were enslaved didn't get anything after slavery. They weren't allowed really to have anything to build a life with after they had given generations of free labor. There are different experiments in the United States, in South Carolina, in the Sea Islands. There is essentially kind of a project where they give the land of their former enslavers to former enslaved people. They create, you know, farms, they create businesses, they get educated. They offer this really great example of how, if just given the opportunity, African Americans can and will do for themselves. But still, that land ends up being taken away in the United States because even for Republicans, who at this time are pretty anti-slavery, they still can't see taking away land from a white Confederate and giving it to a Black person, even if that Black person was loyal, even if they fought for the Union. But in Indian territory, it's a little different thinking. It's the idea that, Native Americans, maybe they really never even deserved that land in the first place, so it's not as kind of huge thing to give that land then to African Americans. And for Republicans, the more kind of radical ones who see this as an idea, an opportunity to allow African Americans to show that they can be part of this kind of small farm-owning American citizenry that is the dream for a lot of people, they say this is the perfect opportunity. Like, let's give this to African Americans who are probably more productive than those lazy Indians, stereotype, and see what they can do. And so that's how my family got their farms, which is still in my generations in Oklahoma. And so when I think about how putting Black and Native American history together means that there are points in time in history where African Americans suffer and Native Americans benefit, and then from the same program, Native Americans are suffering and African Americans are benefiting. And so the fact that there are thousands of African Americans in Indian Territory who own land is amazing, because that is not the story of most of the South. And yet to know that that land is taken from Native Americans, even if they were slaveholders, as part of the larger process of dispossessing Native Americans, that's also, not such a great feeling, because it really is a continuation of what was happening from the very beginning of kind of American colonization. But, turning back to the positive, this freedom and this rights and this land puts the former slaves of Native people on really kind of a different plane. It gives them different opportunities than African Americans have in the United States. And so there are a few economists who have done work on this and show that having land gives you, the more probability of getting educated, of your children doing better for themselves than you did, of owning a farm that can then maybe turn into, a larger farm, or you can build things on that land. And that is what happens. So I want to kind of show you some of my family's story and how that land gave them the ability to create more than just, a farm, maybe. And so this is Ardmore, Oklahoma. Ardmore is about between the two kind of big cities in this area, so between Oklahoma City and between Dallas-Fort Worth, south central Oklahoma. And this is the main street of Ardmore in the early 1900s. So it looks about Main Street in lots of different American cities at this period of time. And so my great-grandfather, Jack Roberts, and his family used their land to raise cows and chickens, and they planted trees. They pulled their money together in the community to buy what was called a case threshing machine. So when you had large acreage, or you were pulling together to farm different plots of land together, this would help you process the grains. And so Jack and his family built a general store. And so general stores in the late 1800s and early 1900s were more than just stores. Like, yes, you could buy things, and usually you were buying on credit because you didn't have the money. So you'd buy, and then when your farming or your produce and everything came in and you could sell that, then you would pay the store owner back. But these were also places where people got together. This is where you got the news. This is where you sent mail. Stores were everything in this period of time. Another thing that was important to most people of African descent in this period of time was education. And so Jack Roberts and a lot of people in his community built the first Black school in the Chickasaw Nation. And so the same project that is happening in the United States after the Civil War, with people trying to find loved ones, get educated, figure out what they're going to do with their lives, is happening in these Indian nations. And so the school that my family builds is called Dawes Academy. Dawes Academy has 2 stories with classrooms, a dining room, a kitchen, and dorms for teachers, boys, and girls. So this is a report listing the students at Dawes Academy. If you look closely, you can see a few Robertses. There are also Johnsons, Coheys, Smiths, Wilsons, people who were in this community and who had been owned by the same people, or their family members or friends. Just as in the United States, a lot of these schools are started and run by religious societies. So this is a tally from the American Baptist Home Mission Society. It shows the assistant principal, Miss Mary Dawes. It shows the number of students. So this is about a medium-sized school. This is an article that was written about the school. really kind of focusing on Miss Dawes, that principle, but also how people from the community come together, people of Black descent as well as Native American students at this place. So at the time that this article was written, the oldest student at the time was George Roberts, my great-great-uncle, and he paid about $27 today in order to go to this school per month. So my family and others in these Indian nations were able to create communities. And of course, this is also what's happening in the United States, yes. But the ability to have ownership of your property is really a difference, and not just physically and economically, but it's also, your mindset, I think, is different because in the South, people are sharecropping, a term you're probably familiar with, the idea that you don't own land, but you're really farming someone else's property. You may or may not get paid at the end of that. Some people just get paid with the fruits of their labor, often not fairly, and it puts really people into the same cycle that they were in slavery because they aren't building wealth. They aren't building anything of their own, really. They're still, unfortunately, beholden to a lot of white plantation owners, formerly, who don't have a desire to treat them with respect and fairness. And so because Indian Territory is this different experience and this different opportunity, African Americans in the United States start hearing about this. They say, wait, there are Black people who own their own land, and they're technically not that far away if you're in somewhere like Mississippi or even Arkansas or Texas. And so the presence of these Black people formerly owned by Native Americans is the reason that you get hundreds of thousands of people going to Indian Territory. So you maybe know about white settlement there and the land rush, the Sooners, the football team, those are people who come. But there are also African Americans who come, enticed by the same idea that property ownership can be transformative, but that also the idea that you're not swamped by basically white people who are in the South committing violence against you, because there isn't a huge amount of white settlers yet. It's Black and Native people in this place. And so people who are, have a family member who was lynched, they want to go to a place that they see as an opportunity. And so there are lots of African American leaders who are looking for spaces for this Black progress, and a lot of them see Indian Territory as this place. And they even call it the opportunity to carve out their future destiny under the shining sun of heaven. So very hopeful words. And there are competing ideas for what Indian Territory can be, meaning there are Black people saying this can be an all-Black state. Like this can be a space where if you say you don't want African Americans around you, fine, let us go to our own place, let us build for ourselves and be free of racial violence. At the same time, Indian nations who are already here are saying, no, this should be an all-Indian state. Like we also want to be free of white violence and white intrusion. Like let us govern ourselves like we have already done for thousands of years. And so this kind of competing idea of what this place should be means that eventually Oklahoma becomes the space with the most all-Black towns in the United States. So in the early 1900s, you have all of these spaces. Today, unfortunately, a lot of them are ghost towns, dead towns where no one lives. But even today, there are often buildings that stand. There are a few places where you can go and see information about them. One of these places, Boley, was actually the largest Black town in the early 1900s, and Boley was from the land of a Creek free girl, meaning a Black girl whose parents were owned by Creek Native Americans. And so the African American towns that are part of this movement after the Civil War are usually a mixture of Black people who were owned by Native Americans and Black people who were owned by Native or white Americans coming together. So bringing their land, bringing their resources, bringing people from the United States. And so Boley eventually has over 55 businesses. So they have a hardware store, they have a drugstore, a printing company, a hat shop, a grocery and dry goods. They have a newspaper. And so Boley especially is written about a lot because it is, to many, an example of African American economic success. And Boley is also similar to what becomes the Greenwood district of Tulsa. And so you have these all Black towns, but you also have Black communities within larger white communities and towns and cities. And so I kind of want to end on the note of Tulsa because now it's a lot more well known. When I first started giving this talk, it was not. But I want to tie the kind of history that we've talked about to now this more well-known event. So I grew up in California. My grandfather is from Oklahoma. And so he also didn't grow up with the knowledge of what I'm going to talk about, which is the Tulsa Massacre. And so the kind of black community in Tulsa had, similar to Boley, lots of different businesses run by and operated and financed by African Americans. You had a movie theater, you had a bank, you had stores, you had black people who were professionals, so dentists, doctors, lawyers. And on May 31st, 1921, much of these businesses were destroyed by white Tulsans who were angry. And so, when I kind of talk to my students about this period of time, they often are confused because they say, I don't understand, like the federal government and individual white Americans are saying, black people, you need to stop being lazy. You need to take care of yourselves. You need to make sure that after slavery, like you're not becoming, a pox in the community. What are you doing for yourselves? But then when black people do it, like when they show, well, of course we can like make things of ourselves. Of course we can get educated. Of course we can become professionals and build our own cities and spaces. Then a lot of those same white Americans get angry. And some of that anger takes the form of violence, the destruction of not just property, but also lives. And so in Tulsa today, there is still archaeological research going on to find how many people even died in this incidence of violence. And in 1921 is really just a continuation of the past few years before that, coming out of World War I, where there were massacres across the country, from Elaine, Arkansas to Chicago, all across the West and unfortunately many places in the North and South, where the same thing is happening, where black communities are destroyed. And this event used to be called the Tulsa Race Riot, but I think historians and journalists have really pushed back on that idea because a riot is kind of equal. Like, oh, these two groups are coming together, they're fighting, they're both kind of equally maybe responsible. But a massacre, I think, gives a better and more accurate idea of what's happening. Because African Americans, they don't want violence. They just want to live on their own peacefully. They just want to take care of themselves and their families in a way that they hadn't been able to do during slavery. And so we have images of the devastation, things like this that used to be homes and businesses. And maybe what not everyone understands about the massacre is that it's not just kind of this one-time thing that happens in the space of a day. It actually is an extended period of time because you have people marched into basically pens. So metal pens where they're set up, tents where people are forced to stay until they have a white neighbor or an employer who can come and say, yes, I trust this black person, they're a good black person, they're not going to commit violence or be angry at what happened, you should let them go. And so some people stay in these pens for weeks, even months. And yet a lot of the information about this event was destroyed. It was not passed down. It took over a decade or decades for it to spread and eventually for it to be on the news, really. And so it was the 100th anniversary of this in 2021, and I think it's really important to understand this event as its own kind of important representative thing that's happened in American history to show that there are ups and downs in race relations, that black people have at many different points of time shown what they can do, and that's been ignored. But it's also part of this trajectory that I'm trying to kind of shape for you, that people of African ancestry and Native American nations are some of the first people enslaved in the West. So the people who are bringing slavery to the West are Native American nations, not necessarily white Americans in every place. Then once that happens, they're some of the first people who are freed and who are given rights. And those rights take place in Native American nations, not necessarily in the United States first. Then after that, those black people own land, and they are spurring this migration of African Americans to this space. And black people from the US are coming because of the black presence already in these spaces. And so there are, so many more things that I could talk about with the intersection of black and Native American history, but I think it really shows how in our classes, I think in K through 12, we're often taught that history is, a series of dates to be memorized, maybe some cool battles during wars, but that it's actually a lot more complicated. And that when we look at the way, especially people of color related to one another, we see that there's a deeper story there. That there are similarities and parallels in many different ways, but there are also many times that we've worked against one another instead of maybe working together. That it's not just a black-white story, the United States, that it's also a multiracial, multi-ethnic story that tells us that we have committed many atrocities maybe, but there can be so much hope if we actually work together and come together to acknowledge this history and move past it. So thank you for listening. So can I answer any questions for you? Yeah.
I had always heard that the Seminole in Florida helped escape slavery. Can you elaborate on that?
I can. So the Seminoles are included in the 5 tribes that I've shown, but they also have a slightly different and more complicated story because, yes, as you say, they're in Florida. They're a little distant from the rest of the tribes who are kind of in this core of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. And they move actually because they have a lot of differences with the Creeks. And so one of the differences is they say, we don't want to adopt in the same way to these European and American norms about race and about capitalism. And so they move from Alabama, Georgia, they go to Florida, they have these different relationships with people of African descent because they're on their own. And so when black people run away to their Florida settlements, they say, you can be part of our community, partly because we need you to help defend ourselves against white people who are moving into Florida. And so the Seminoles, they eventually have a series of wars, 3 wars that are really from the early 1800s to the 1830s and 40s against settlement. So even initially it's Florida, initially it's the Spanish who are in Florida, who the Seminoles are fighting with and allying against alternately, and then it's American settlers who want to move into Florida. And so the Seminoles have different towns that they allow black people to live in, so they aren't necessarily living together, but people who are considered black Seminoles have their own towns, but they have friendly relationships. And so when settlers come in, they all work together to fight against these settlers, and they consider themselves equals. But when most of these Seminoles kind of lose the Second War, meaning a lot of them are killed and some of them give up, they then move to Indian Territory, and the Seminoles and black Seminoles who move to Indian Territory, then, for reasons we still don't fully understand, they begin to have a more traditional enslaver relationship. And so the black people who move there, they no longer have equal rights. They're no longer considered kind of part of the Seminole Nation. They're now kind of treated as slaves, people who are inferior. But still, it's definitely a different relationship and a different history, but I think it shows that when they go from being on their own and having their own ideas about race and community to being alongside other slaveholders and Native people who are treating black people differently, they unfortunately kind of get sucked into that mindset and they change.
Thank you.
Okay.
Slavery within the Native American nations, wasn't there a difference in how they were treated versus the way they were treated in the antebellum South? Considered the brutality of the antebellum South versus the Native American nations. Was it a more humane type of situation versus the antebellum South?
That is a common question, and that is because that has kind of been an idea spread since the 1800s. And the answer is no, it was not different in that in both the white South and the Native American South, every slave owner was different. So there were, like when you look at the records from black people owned by Native Americans talking about their experiences, there are some of them who say, my owner was kind to me, we slept on the floor together, we ate together, we worked in the field together. Those are usually people who owned maybe 5 to 7 enslaved people, so not huge plantations. Then there are people who owned huge plantations, and those former slaves say, no, my master beat someone to death. Like he enjoyed treating us like sadistically. The same things that you see in the US South. So there's a diversity of experience and a diversity of slave owners. So we cannot say with a broad stroke that one group of slave owners was any better than the other.
Oh. I'm not even sure how to frame this question, but one of the difficulties I encounter in thinking about history and events and people who we revere in our history for their acts and whatever, and how to reconcile their behaviors and the things that they did, comparing our morals of today versus the times in which they lived, from our founding fathers who were slave owners, and yet we revere them, the Jeffersons, the Washingtons. Andrew Jackson is one that comes to mind, who has a very nefarious reputation as he treated Native Americans in Florida and in the southeast. And yet these are people that did so many good things. I guess maybe, I don't know what the question is. The question is, do we judge these people by today's mores, or based upon in the times, in what was normal or thought of okay in their lifetimes?
So, oh no, I know exactly what you mean. And I mean, most of my students have the same question when they come into my classes on Black or Native American history. And so the idea that there is kind of ever a consensus on something like slavery or Indian removal or any treatment of anyone anywhere is, I think, something that comes from maybe the simplification of the way we learn history in school. But what I love to do in college is that I get to show my students all these different documents. I get to show them that Thomas Jefferson had friends and neighbors who, were freeing their slaves and saying, hey, I realize maybe slavery is bad, and like Thomas Jefferson, like, you should also free your slaves. Like, what do you think about these ideas about abolition? And Jefferson says, I'm not really willing to do that. So people like Jefferson, George Washington, all of these people are aware of the options that they have, just like Native people are aware of the options that they have. There's always the option not to engage, not to participate, or to later realize in your life, hey, maybe that was wrong. Now I want to change in these ways. And so I think our responsibility as people now is to be aware and familiarize ourselves with as much as we can that's going on in that period of time, that there aren't kind of these abolitionists who appear out of nowhere in the 1850s, that in fact the United States has an abolitionist movement from the very beginning of its founding, and that leaders of these time are aware of it. They could have changed. Some of them choose to, some of them choose not to, and that along with their actions, yes, maybe they founded the United States, yes, but what does it mean that someone like Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence while owning slaves? Like, how can we reconcile that if he himself couldn't reconcile it? And he has so many writings, so many journals about not being able to reconcile it, not being able to take that final courageous step. And so of course, you should teach both of these things. Like, you should teach the full humanity of these men, because we are full humans, and we need to understand that they're not any different or better than us, that we also have difficult choices to make about what we support and what we advocate for.
Just as a quick follow-up, where this came to my mind, in my evolution, or trying to think about it, is Robert E. Lee. Revered by many, especially in the southern states or whatever. But the abolitionists wouldn't have liked Robert E. Lee and how he conducted himself. And yet, for a lot of people, I remember when I was growing up, it was Lee versus Grant. Which was the better general? Which was the better person? And we attributed certain personality traits to one versus the other. But my personal view of Lee over the years is not as favorable as what I was taught in school. The more I learned, more in depth of what his beliefs and things were. But anyway, that's just a comment.
I mean, Lee is also kind of interesting because after the war, he's kind of like, okay, we made our decision, like, let's get over it, like, let's maybe not be lynching African Americans, and also let's not make monuments of former enslavers and Confederates. So if these people are a spectrum, like, he's not the worst, like, but they're, again, complexity, right? Like, understanding the complexity of people, and that human beings are different people at different points in time. And that even someone like Abraham Lincoln, who is revered, if we look at African Americans and maybe the abolition of slavery, he's the emancipator, like, after a while, after he stopped supporting colonization. But then also when you look at Native Americans, he's maybe not so great. So, like, history is complicated, but that's, I think, the fun part, and that's what we need to emphasize to students and to, our average Americans, not that it is memorization and deification of people.
So, do you know if the black population was ever as large of a percentage in Indian Territory as it was the South?
Oh, it definitely wasn't, no.
And then, building on that, do you think that a large population of black people in Indian Territory was used to justify Manifest Destiny?
In a way, so the way the federal government conceptualized Native American identity and black identity through the 1700s and 1800s were completely opposite, meaning for the purposes of slavery, if you had one black ancestor, you were considered black. If your mother was black, you were considered black because it was best that, white enslavers be able to, unfortunately sexually abuse women and that those children would still be slaves. Whereas Native Americans, the fewer Native Americans you had, the better, because then you had people who needed less land, then you had less power on the part of tribal nations. And so as the federal government looks further west into Indian Territory, the fact that there are black people in these nations and some mixed race black and Native people, they're then able to say, are you really tribal nations? Like, do we really even have to honor these treaties with you and your land? Because maybe you're actually just a group of black people who have no rights, not fully sovereign independent nations. And so that is the reason for some of the discrimination that we see later on. Okay, I'm trying not to complicate this too much, but so after the Civil War, I've told you these Native nations have to adopt these people, they give them rights, they are citizens, but in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there is discrimination in these nations, and they try to push black people out as citizens, and it's because of that continuing idea that if you have black people in your nations, you're maybe not black, and you maybe don't have the same rights as Native people. And so, yes, and that takes place in the 1800s, but then also technically all the way to today, because Native people are scared of not being seen as Native, of not having and carrying on those same rights.
Thank you. But I'd like to elaborate. Can you talk about the Tulsa experience and if you still have any family ties and the history that your family experienced personally? But thank you so much for what you're sharing with us, because we weren't taught correctly growing up in our school.
Well, thank you for coming. So the city where my family lives is about 2 hours from Tulsa. They have one great aunt who was living near Tulsa at the time. Fortunately, she and her family weren't involved or impacted by that. But the most famous firsthand account of the Tulsa Massacre actually comes from someone from my family's community who was owned by a Chickasaw slave owner. So Buck Colbert Franklin, if maybe you're aware of the great African-American historian John Hope Franklin, who wrote a lot in the early 1900s. Buck Colbert Franklin lived in Tulsa. He is the one who, he's the reason that we know that there were bombs dropped from planes, turpentine bombs. Kind of the first local kind of warfare on one's own population was used in Tulsa Massacre, because he realized buildings were catching fire from the top. And so how else could that be happening if there weren't, planes dropping these bombs? He tells us that there were women and children being shot in the streets. That there were people who he saw as his neighbor, people who he thought were his friend, coming in, shooting people, taking advantage of this. And so as a lawyer, he was kind of the first on the scene, and he was able to help a lot of people keep their property because they tried to, in the aftermath, create a law that said you can't have a building that's more than, I think it was 2 stories. Or maybe it's the opposite. You had to have a building that was more than 2 stories, and people could not rebuild that fast. So they were basically trying to push these African Americans who had just lost so much out. So he was able to stop that in court. But a lot of the African Americans had insurance policies that were not, kept. They just said they washed their hands of it. They didn't kind of abide by the guidelines that they had instilled themselves. And so the kind of freedmen or the Native American and black story is intersected with African American story there, because these are some of the black people who experience this, some of the people who lose property, and then also the people who see it and realize, like, you know, the place that we had because we were living in Indian nations is now gone. And the white American city that's been built around us, and the federal government and the state now that exists, has really, you know, changed this and kind of stifled some of the opportunities that we previously had.
When I did hear that the blacks, when they first came there, it was the Native Americans that brought them in on their reservations, I guess you want to say.
In the 1830s. Mhm.
Right, and then as they grew up around there, I guess most of the white folks, because they were doing better than them. But was that group one of the ones that was trying to push the blacks out in Tulsa?
Which group?
I don't know which one was there, which one out of the 5 tribes. Was any of those in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Yes, Tulsa is on land claimed mostly by the Cherokee Nation.
Okay. I did hear that they brought them on when most of the blacks started going west. And they okayed for them to come on their land. And that's how they got Black Wall Street started.
Yes, so when this is parceled up after the Civil War, some of that land is native and black people owned by natives, that claimed by them, and then some of that is opened in things like the land run. So then you have kind of a checkerboard where there are black and black native people there, and then white people, sometimes side by side, sometimes completely separated, and then Black Wall Street is kind of in the middle of those things. So you have some black and native people there, and then you have some white people there. So yes, the white people who are moving in around them are some of the people trying to force those people off their land.
Wasn't Black Wall Street partially rebuilt even a couple of times, and then later on they ran the interstate through the city or and divided it so that business and things could not survive there? Mm-hmm. We talk
Yes,
about that.
so this is-
One more question.
Okay.
And do you believe these people should receive reparations for the property and stuff they lost because there was a lawsuit and they end up losing the lawsuit?
Right, yes. When I was in Oklahoma a few years ago, I got a chance to meet the woman and her brother who were at the center of this lawsuit, and it's tragic and yet somehow not surprising, unfortunately, that, you know, the city didn't do the right thing. Yes, I do think they're owed reparations because this first destruction that happens in the Black Wall Street Tulsa massacre, that capital is never recouped. Like, yes, you know, African Americans rebuild. Yes, there are resilient people who are able to pull together, you know, more money. But some of those people, they leave and they never come back. And so the people who didn't have the same education opportunities after that, she talks about her, one of her parents died. No, like, you can't, I think, account for that. I mean, you can't even account for it in monetary terms, of course, but it would be something. It would be an acknowledgement that, yes, African Americans rebuild, but I talk about this all the time with some of my students who are immigrants, because they say, you know, why are African Americans who have been here so long, like, why is there so much poverty? When African immigrants come here and they build, or Chinese immigrants come here and they build and they're doing great, but that's because these immigrants come in later. They haven't had to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild like African Americans have. And, you know, we shouldn't have to have that sort of moral resilience. Like, we shouldn't have to do that. And you can see, I hope, that generationally that would be passed down, the idea that, you know, why even bother? They're just going to take it from you again. And so, yes, I think that should be acknowledged, and I think that that should be repaid in some way, anyway.
Any more questions?